September 14, 1944. Aachen, Germany. The first German city on the Western Front to fall into Allied hands, and the men defending it had been told to hold it to the last stone. The 246th Volksgrenadier Division occupied basements, church towers, factory floors, and shattered apartment buildings across a city that Hitler had personally ordered to defend as a symbol of the Reich itself. The orders were explicit: no surrender, no withdrawal, every street is a fortress, every room is a fighting position. The men doing the fighting had been through enough war to know what that kind of order really meant. It meant they were going to die here, in the rubble of a coal and steel city on the Belgian border, and nobody was coming to get them out. What they could not have predicted, what no officer in the Volksgrenadier briefings had prepared them for, was that the men trying to kill them would also be the men who kept them alive long enough to be taken prisoner. The first time a German soldier in Aachen watched an American medic crawl across open ground under fire to reach a wounded enemy combatant, he did not know what to make of it. The man was risking his life for a soldier who had been shooting at him 20 minutes earlier. There was no tactical logic to it. There was no military benefit. There was only a man with a red cross on his helmet moving through broken glass and falling plaster toward someone who needed help, and doing it the same way he would have done it for one of his own. This is the story of what American combat medics did in the Second World War that German soldiers, hardened veterans of the Eastern Front and the African Campaign and 4 years of a war that had progressively stripped them of every illusion, could not explain within any framework their training had given them. It is also the story of what that behavior cost the men who performed it, and what it revealed about the difference between two armies that both believed they were fighting for civilization. To understand why German soldiers reacted the way they did to American medical care in the field, you had to understand what they were comparing it to. The German army's medical system was not primitive. The Wehrmacht had field surgeons, sanitators, stretcher bearers, and aid stations positioned at regimental level that could perform emergency procedures within range of the guns. German medical training was thorough. German surgical skill was, by any clinical measure, among the best in the world. What the German system did not have, in any consistent or reliable form by 1944, was a doctrine of treating enemy wounded with the same urgency as friendly casualties. This was not a written policy of neglect. It was something quieter than that. It was the product of 4 years of a war on the Eastern Front that had progressively erased the boundaries between military necessity and moral permission. German soldiers who had served in Russia had watched the systematic abandonment of Soviet wounded, had been present at or heard of actions against enemy prisoners that no Geneva Convention phrasing could accommodate, and had absorbed over time the operational assumption that enemy wounded were a problem to be managed, not a responsibility to be honored. By the time those veterans arrived on the Western Front, they carried that assumption with them like a second uniform. It shaped the way they expected the war to work. What they encountered instead was a system that had been built from the ground up around the opposite idea. The United States Army's combat medic program in the Second World War was not an improvisation. It had been designed, argued over, revised, and codified before the first American soldier set foot in North Africa. The central principle was simple and absolute. The medic treats the man in front of him based on how badly that man is hurt, not on which side he is fighting for. This principle had roots older than the American Army itself. The Geneva Conventions of 1864 and their subsequent revisions had established the legal framework. The American military had signed and ratified those frameworks. But the gap between a signed treaty and what a 22-year-old medic does under fire in a German city is enormous, and what filled that gap in the American case was something the treaty writers had not anticipated. It was the men themselves. The combat medic of the Second World War was not a soldier who had failed to qualify for a fighting role. He was, in many cases, the man who had specifically requested a non-combatant position because he held a moral conviction about killing that his country chose to accommodate rather than override. A significant proportion of American combat medics were conscientious objectors, men who had told their draft boards that they would serve their country but would not carry a weapon, and who had been assigned to the medical corps as a result. Among the most documented of these was Desmond Doss, a Seventh-day Adventist from Lynchburg, Virginia, who refused on religious grounds to carry a firearm and who ultimately received the Medal of Honor for actions on Okinawa in May of 1945. Doss evacuated 75 wounded men from a cliff under continuous Japanese fire over the course of a single night, lowering each one individually on a rope while praying aloud that God would let him save just one more. He was not the exception. He was the articulation of something that ran through the medical corps across every theater of the war. The men who chose to enter fire without weapons had made a decision about what kind of person they intended to remain inside a war, and that decision was visible on the battlefield in ways that both allies and enemies could read. At Aachen in September of 1944, the men of the 30th Infantry Division pushing through the city's destroyed streets were supported by medics who had been drilled in a protocol that felt, to the German soldiers watching from the buildings they still held, like something from a different moral universe. An American medic in a firefight did not wait for the shooting to stop. He identified the most critically wounded man he could reach, determined the safest available approach, and moved. The approach might take him across a street junction covered by a German machine gun. It might take him through the ground floor of a building still being contested room by room. It might take him into a space where the only thing protecting him from being shot was the red cross on his arm and the assumption that the men with their fingers on the triggers across from him had agreed to honor it. That assumption was not always correct. German SS units in particular fired on American medics with a consistency that became a documented pattern in divisional after-action reports. The 1st SS Panzer Division in the Ardennes later that winter would generate a documented record of targeting medical personnel that American commanders raised formally through military channels. But in the regular Wehrmacht units, particularly by the autumn of 1944 when the war in the West had settled into the grinding urban and defensive combat that replaced the movement of earlier years, something different happened. The German soldiers who watched American medics' work began, over time, to enforce an informal ceasefire around medical activity. This was not a treaty. It was not a written agreement. It was a recognition, passed between men on both sides through the unspoken grammar of combat, that something was being honored in the field that was worth protecting even in the middle of a war neither side was able to stop. The mechanics of how this worked are documented in unit histories, in letters home, in prisoner of war interrogation transcripts, and in the memoirs of men who survived both the war and the decades that followed it. A German sniper in a third-floor window of a gutted textile factory in Aachen would hold his fire when a figure with a red cross moved through his sights. Not always, not with any guarantee, but often enough that it became a pattern the American medics could factor into their calculations. A German non-commissioned officer whose squad had been pinned behind a collapsed wall would, on more than one documented occasion, call a halt to outgoing fire when an American medic appeared between positions, specifically to allow the medical work to proceed. What produced this behavior in men who were simultaneously trying to kill each other was not softness. The German soldiers of 1944 were not soft men. They had endured things that most people living comfortable peacetime lives cannot begin to imagine. What produced it was recognition. The German soldier watching the American medic work was watching someone do something he understood. He had seen his own sanitator do the same thing for German casualties. He knew what the work cost. He knew the specific quality of courage required to move toward a wounded man in a firefight when every functional instinct in a human nervous system is screaming in the opposite direction. When he saw that same thing being done for an enemy casualty, the recognition was visceral and immediate. This man is doing what I would want done for me. This is the deepest root of what German soldiers described in interrogations and letters as respect, a word that does not translate cleanly but carries connotations of acknowledgement, recognition of quality, something earned rather than given. The respect that German veterans of the Western Front expressed toward American medics was not affection. It was not friendship. It was the specific recognition that the men on the other side of the line had chosen to remain human beings inside a war that was doing its best to make that choice impossible. The American combat medic's equipment in 1944 reflected the intensity of what he was expected to do. He carried no rifle. He carried sulfa powder and sulfa tablets, morphine syrettes in labeled pouches, battle dressings in multiple sizes, plasma, litter if his unit was properly equipped, and tourniquets that he had been trained to apply in the dark by feel alone. His helmet was marked with a red cross on white. His arm bore the same marking. Under the Geneva Convention, these markings were supposed to make him a protected person on the battlefield. In practice, they made him a visible target whose protection depended entirely on the moral decision of every individual with a weapon who happened to be looking his way. The morphine was critical. By 1944, the American medical supply chain had succeeded in pushing morphine forward in a form that individual medics could administer without a physician present, a small disposable syringe that could be injected directly through clothing in the field. The medic who reached a badly wounded man had a protocol. Check the airway, control the bleeding, cover the wound, administer morphine if the man was conscious and the wound warranted it. Mark the man's forehead with a grease pencil to indicate that morphine had been given, preventing a fatal double dose by the next medic or surgeon who reached him. The mark on the forehead was a detail that German prisoners of war mentioned repeatedly in interrogation transcripts. They had seen it on wounded German soldiers who had been treated by American medics after being captured or while lying in contested ground between the lines. The care indicated by the mark, the fact that the American medic had thought far enough ahead about the man's continued survival to prevent accidental overdose at a subsequent treatment point, communicated something about the seriousness with which the American medical system regarded the obligation to keep the man in front of it alive. A soldier who is treated that carefully is being regarded as a person with a future. The plasma was the other detail that German soldiers and German medical personnel taken prisoner consistently mentioned. By 1944, American forward aid stations were administering blood plasma to stabilize casualties for transport who would otherwise die of shock before reaching a hospital. The logistical effort required to get plasma to a battalion aid station in an active urban combat zone was considerable. It required a supply chain that prioritized medical material alongside ammunition and food. It required trained personnel who could start a plasma drip under fire in a basement or a shattered building. It required the institutional belief, built into the American military supply system at the level of planning and procurement, that keeping wounded men alive was worth the logistical cost. German medical personnel who encountered American aid stations after being captured remarked, in interrogation records preserved in the National Archives, on the quantity of medical supplies they found. They remarked on the organization. They remarked on the speed with which American medics moved. And they remarked, with a consistency that amounts to a pattern across different theaters and different periods of the war, on the fact that the supplies and the organization were applied without distinction to whoever needed them, regardless of uniform. The city of Aachen fell to the 30th Infantry Division on October 21, 1944. The German garrison, surrounded, out of ammunition, having fought room by room and floor by floor for weeks, surrendered. The men who came out of the cellars and the ruins were in bad condition. They were wounded, starving, exhausted, and in some cases barely recognizable as soldiers. What they encountered when they surrendered was American medical personnel doing triage on the spot, prioritizing the most severely wounded German soldiers for immediate treatment, and getting plasma started within minutes of capture. A German officer who had commanded one of the last holdout positions in the city and who was interrogated by American intelligence shortly after the surrender described this moment in terms that his interrogator thought worth transcribing verbatim. He said he had expected to be shot. He said that the medical treatment he received within an hour of surrendering was better than what he had received from German military medicine at any point in the previous 2 years. He said he did not understand it. The interrogation transcript notes that he repeated this last point 3 times. He did not understand it. This incomprehension was not unique to him. It appeared again and again in the records of German prisoners of war processed through American facilities across both the European and Pacific theaters. The men who came out of the fighting expecting hostility and encountered medical care instead were experiencing a collision between what their war had taught them to expect and what was actually happening to them. The disorientation this produced was genuine and in some cases profound. It was not that they were ungrateful. It was that the thing being done for them did not fit inside any category their experience had prepared them to process. To understand the full weight of this, you need to understand what medical care on the Eastern Front had looked like for the German soldiers who had served there before arriving in the West. The Eastern Front was a war without margins. It was fought at scales and with a brutality that the Western Front, terrible as it was, did not fully replicate. German soldiers wounded in Russia faced a medical system that was chronically undersupplied, understaffed, and operating under a command culture that prioritized the fighting capacity of units over the survival of individual men. The wounded who could not be evacuated were sometimes left. The wounded who could be evacuated faced transport conditions in winter that killed men who might otherwise have survived their injuries. Frostbite, sepsis, and wound infections carried by the Russian winters and the Russian mud killed men who had survived their initial wounds. And the Soviet wounded those same German soldiers encountered were treated with a casualness that ranged from neglect to deliberate killing depending on the unit, the commander, and the specific tactical situation. By the time German soldiers who had served in Russia arrived on the Western Front and encountered the American medical system, they had been shaped by years of a war in which the wounded on both sides were, at best, a logistical problem and, at worst, a liability to be managed with whatever means were available. The contrast with what they saw American medics doing was not subtle. It was absolute. It was the difference between a war that regarded wounded men as a cost and a war that regarded wounded men as an obligation. The obligation the American Army had codified in its medical doctrine was not sentimentality. It was a strategic calculation with a long history behind it. The American military had studied the relationship between medical care and unit combat effectiveness and had arrived at a conclusion that shaped procurement, training, and field doctrine for the entire war. Soldiers fight harder when they believe that if they are wounded, someone will come for them. The knowledge that the medic will move under fire, that the plasma will be there, that the aid station will take them in and work on them without stopping until they are stable or dead, is not a moral amenity. It is a combat multiplier. It changes the calculation a soldier makes when he is told to move across ground he knows is covered. An army that believes its wounded will be abandoned fights differently from an army that believes its wounded will be retrieved. The Americans had built a medical system around the second belief, and the fighting quality it produced in their infantry was visible to every German unit that engaged them. The medics who created this effect were not, for the most part, thinking about strategic calculations when they moved through fire to reach a wounded man. They were thinking about the man. They had been selected and trained for a specific quality of character, the ability to act on what they could see in front of them rather than on what the situation theoretically permitted. What they could see in front of them was a human being in pain who was going to die without help. That was the calculation they were making. Everything else was secondary. Private First Class Clarence Richmond of the 3rd Infantry Division treated casualties during the fighting at Anzio in February of 1944 under conditions that his unit's after-action report described in the flat military language that compresses horror into logistics. His aid station was in a drainage ditch 400 meters from the German forward positions. The incoming fire was continuous. He treated 43 casualties in a single day, working through the night after the day's fighting had ended, moving between men by the light of a dimmed flashlight he held in his teeth so he could keep both hands free. He did not stop when he ran out of dressings. He tore strips from his own uniform and used them. He stayed beside each man he could not fully help and kept talking to them, because he had been told and believed that a wounded man who hears a calm voice in the dark has a better chance of surviving shock than one who is left alone in silence. Richmond received the Silver Star. He was 20 years old. At Hürtgen Forest in the autumn of 1944, the medical personnel of the 4th Infantry Division worked in conditions that veterans described for the rest of their lives as the worst they encountered in the entire war. The forest was a nightmare of mud, cold, mines, and artillery that could not be predicted or outrun. German mortar crews had registered every trail and every clearing. Moving a wounded man through the forest required carrying him by hand over terrain that defeated vehicles and defeated stretchers and defeated every tool designed to make the work easier. The medics carried their casualties out on their backs, in their arms, on improvised litters made from rifle slings and pine branches, through mud that pulled at every step and cold that numbed the hands before the first kilometer was covered. The German units across from them in the forest knew who the medics were. The red cross on the helmet was visible even in the gray light that filtered through the pines. The informal ceasefire that German soldiers had begun observing around American medical activity in other sectors appeared in the Hürtgen too, though with less consistency because the close-range forest fighting made deliberate restraint harder to maintain. But there are documented instances, preserved in the letters and memoirs of German veterans of that campaign, of soldiers holding fire specifically because they could see a red cross moving through the trees. The letters German soldiers sent home during the Western Campaign of 1944 and 1945 contain a recurring figure that historians of the period have noted across dozens of collections. The American medic appears in them as something the writers do not have a clean word for. These were not men given to sentimentality about their enemies. They had been fighting for years. They had buried friends. The emotional range available in their letters had been narrowed by everything they had been through to a few essential registers: duty, exhaustion, occasional dark humor, fierce protectiveness of the men beside them. And into that narrowed vocabulary, the American medic kept appearing as something they described with the word anstand, which translates as decency but carries the sense of behavior that rises above what the situation requires, what the war permits, what any reasonable accounting of self-interest would endorse. The man with the Red Cross was doing something the war did not require of him. The soldiers watching him knew it. By February of 1945, as American armies crossed the Rhine and drove into the interior of Germany, the campaign entered its final phase. German units were collapsing, surrendering in masses, retreating through a country being destroyed from above and pushed through from both sides. The casualties from this phase were enormous and chaotic, and the American medical system was stretched to its limit processing them. What it did not do, under any circumstances the records document, was stop treating German casualties. In the final weeks of the war, American aid stations in central Germany treated American soldiers wounded in the last defensive actions, German soldiers captured in those same actions, and in some cases German civilians caught in the fighting around the towns through which the advance was moving. The medics working those stations were men who had been in the field since Normandy or longer, who had seen things that left marks no medical training had prepared them for, and who were still doing the same work because the work had not changed even though everything around it had. The moral framework that had produced the American combat medic held intact from the first engagement to the last. It was held at Anzio and at Hürtgen and at Aachen and at the Rhine. It held in the rain and in the cold and in the dark and under fire. It held because the men who carried it understood, in the way people who do important work come to understand the thing they are doing, that the work was worth the cost. The cost was real. The names on casualty lists of American medical units in the European theater represented precisely. The men who paid it or owed something that cannot be fully repaid. The knowledge that what they did was seen, that it was understood, and that even the men on the other side of the line recognized it for what it was. The German officers who wrote after the war about their Western Front experience returned to this theme. Friedrich von Mellenthin, who served as a staff officer across multiple theaters, noted that the conduct of American medical personnel represented something the German command had never found a satisfactory response to. The reason was that the behavior in question was not a tactic. Because the deepest thing German soldiers learned from American medics in the Second World War was not a technique and not a tactic. It was the demonstration, made under the most extreme possible conditions, that the decision to treat every wounded man as a human being worth keeping alive was not a luxury the war made impossible. It was a choice. It could be made and sustained and honored from the first shot to the last. The men who made it carried something through the war that the war could not take from them. That is what earned the respect. That is what made the German soldier hold his fire. And that is what the Red Cross on the helmet came to mean on the Western Front. Not just a protected symbol under international law, but the clearest possible sign of what ordinary men chose to keep alive when the war was doing its best to destroy it.